Before we get back to that, our agenda today is about 30 minutes or so of notes, and then we're heading over to Midkiff. Or no, we don't say Midkiff anymore. That's ethnocentric, right? We learned that last time? Ethnocentric? No? We're going to use a Hawaiian name, Mikikipi. Okay, so take those out. And while you're... Oh. Hang on, let me bring up the beat. Have we done this with the beat before?
I need an outline and I have to take the test.
Okay, the test. I have a junior homeroom. Junior homeroom anytime.
Mercedes-Benz, the best or nothing.
Yes, I'm hip and edgy, just not young. Okay, ready? Just keep it rolling. Ready, set, go. Ready, set, go. 1893, we lost our monarchy. 1843, we gained our sovereignty. 1778, Cook Cookie was not it. The year before, in 1961, we became state 50. Okay. I'll be the guy who stands on the side and just goes, yeah, yeah. Okay. That was dope, as they say. My day. I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know anything about that, even though I teach in the Department of Hippies.
Wait, what?
Hippies. No, at UH I teach in the Peace Studies. Okay, so is this where we ended last time? Ethnocentric? Okay, so remember last time we had some vocab expanders, which I will add into our hua olelo ho vocab. Austere, harsh. This is how the Calvinists were. They were harsh outlook on life. Egalitarian, they were believers in equality. That's a very American kind of religion. Ethnocentric, so bad, good, bad. They thought their culture was the center of the universe. Euro-American culture. That's a word that I use instead of Western. Western doesn't mean too much, right? Euro-American. And then they believed in something called the Protestant work ethic. And the thing is, probably you do too. But, I don't know you that well, so let's find out for sure. So, raise your hand if you think the following statement is true. Okay, here it is. If you work hard, you'll do well, including financially well, and that's a good thing. Raise your hand if you think that's true. If you work hard, you'll do well, including financially well, and that's a good thing.
I think it's a good thing, but I don't think that's not the case.
Okay, so we got a communist in the front row here. Why don't you go back to Russia? But before you go back to Russia, tell us why you hate America so much.
Well, I just well, why do I hate America? Oh well, I guess fallacy. I just don't like.
The
certain
fallacy,
things about-
okay? So
I don't-
give me a counterexample.
What do you mean a counterexample?
Someone you say it's not true that if you work hard you'll do well.
Well, because things get in the way. It doesn't like just because you work hard doesn't mean everything's gonna go well for you.
Okay, so sometimes you work hard and don't do well,
No.
right?
Or
Like
you
that
don't
woman.
End up getting. I mean, you're doing well. You're doing good. Like you're doing good things. But, it
But
doesn't
not
mean your
financially
life's-
well.
Yeah. What do you mean that?
Like that
Depends on
woman
what job
who
you're doing.
died in her car between her 3 jobs, taking a nap,
That's really sad.
works hard. Any other counterexamples? Yeah.
You can be dumb as all hell and have parents who have a lot of money and still be financially well and not working.
So sometimes you don't work hard and do well. Someone comes to mind. George Bush. George Bush. So he gets C's at his C minuses at his prep school, somehow gets into Yale. Not sure if it's because, Grandpa was a member of Congress at the time, Dad was the head of the CIA, later president, first President Bush. And then he gets C minuses at Yale and somehow gets into Harvard Business School, even though he couldn't get into Texas Law School. It's because of Grandpa and Dad. And then he runs for president, and 40% of the people who polled that they supported him thought they were polling for the dad. Because he has the same exact name, George Bush. Right? You guys know there are 2 President Bushes, right? Father and son. And then it was his to lose. Then he was in the lead from that first poll. So the Protestant work ethic is something that most people believe in this society, but it's not a fact. It's not true. There are counterexamples, right? It's probably a good ethic to follow, but that doesn't mean it's true. And it's not in line with the Hawaiian work ethic, which is not about working hard kind of for its own sake. It's more a collective, collaborative thing. Yeah. In the society we're living in, this is probably a good ethic to follow. And most of you, it's so deeply ingrained in you that you don't even realize you believe in it, but you do. Right? That's why I assume most of you believe in it. This is actually the lowest number who say they believe in it of any class I've ever had. Might not be a good thing. But again, it's not always true. It's just an idea. Finally, Calvinists had a fervent desire to save souls from God, and they had an idea of God's personality. This is not a kind, merciful God, but an angry and wrathful God. Wrathful meaning believes in vengeance, right? This is the God from the Old Testament who wipes out entire cities like Sodom and Gomorrah. Yeah.
If they're Protestant, why do they believe in the wrathful God still? Isn't what the same mindset? Did that come with time? Isn't this like more modern age of like Christianity come with time?
The distinction between Protestant and Catholic is not about Old Testament and New Testament. In fact, a lot of Protestants, especially evangelicals, who the Calvinists were at that time. Nowadays, this religion is considered a mainstream religion, but at that time, they were just like New Hope today. They were really into taking the Bible literally and really into conversion. That's why they were here in Hawaii. So a lot of the evangelical religions, they lean heavily on the Old Testament because it has these kind of fire and brimstone, really black and white morality, right? You are wrong, I am right, that kind of thing. Yeah, so it doesn't have much to do with Old and New Testament. That's another question entirely. Okay, so here's some of the traits of the first missionaries who came and that kind of got ingrained in Hawaiian society. And Hawaiian history started to go in a certain direction because of these characteristics. Does that make sense? Okay. So this says, it should say on there, how did missionaries differ from earlier Westerners? Because there's 40 years of Western contact before missionaries arrive. But missionaries were different. They were involved in a word, in a process. It's a word that you should learn, remember, and just start dropping it. Next year in college, just drop this word wherever you can, and it's going to give you extra credit points. The word is colonialism or colonization. Probably this word is a little bit better because it has a zation in it. So what is colonialism? What's the root word? Colony. I know you think it's something boring because it ends in ism. Ism means something boring, right?
Yes.
And most people think that isms are boring because ism is really a way of thinking. And most people would rather die than think, right? So colonialism is the way of thinking involved in the creation of colonies. I'll just say it one more time. The way of thinking involved in the creation of colonies. So Hawaii was, by some accounts, going to become a colony of the United States. Some people say Hawaii is a colony of the United States. Okay, and colonization, azation is a process. So that's the process of actually making those colonies. And that process is not only physical, it's very much mental, right? So the fact that we have U.S. history but not Pacific Island studies in our curriculum it's a mental, we're mentally colonized, right? It doesn't make sense to not study your own context that you're in, which is the Pacific, right? In New Zealand, they study Pacific Island studies because they realize that they're in the Pacific. Is New Zealand more in the Pacific than Hawaii? No, we're right in the very center of it, right? And yet we don't even know anything about it. There was an English teacher who used to give his students a U.S. map and say, name all the states, and then he'd give a Pacific map that was blank and say, name all the countries. And it was like 0. Nobody could get a single one other than Hawaii. So you can name the states of a continent 2,500 miles away, but not the places in your own vicinity, right? Your neighbors. Because we don't think of ourselves as being in the Pacific. And you know what? Neither do the Pacific Islanders. They don't even invite us to Pacific Island games.
When I was in 6th grade at St. Andrews, my history class was Pacific.
See, even the DOE has Pacific Island studies. We don't. That's how we're the direct descendants of these missionaries, right? Intellectually, it went from them to Pauahi, to our founder teachers, the original set of teachers, down to us. And we're still living in that. So some people use the term colonization of the mind and then decolonization of the mind. And a lot of that still needs to happen. Missionaries are different. They're here to stay. They were not interlopers who are just here for a good time on a ship, come on a ship, do some prostitution, drink some rum, and leave. It's basically what the sailors were doing. They were here to stay. They were here to change Hawaiians. They would say civilize Hawaiians. Us looking back, we would say colonize. It's really the same thing. This is a positive way of spinning it. This is a negative way. And probably it's both. It's actually, there's always positives and negatives. And we're going to go over those positive and negatives of missionary contact. Okay, does that make sense so far? Okay, why did they come? Well, back home in America, you might remember from U.S. history, it's good to study U.S. history. They're coming here from a context of an event called the Great Awakening. Not an event, a trend, a process. The Great Awakening And there are actually two Great Awakenings. This is the second one. What is that? Spread of religion. Can anybody tell me a little bit more? Why did they need to spread religion? Too much? What? Oh, very good. Very good. Everybody hear that? Too much industrialization. What does that have to do with religion? Right? Well, the development of cities. Cities tend to favor nuclear families, not extended families, because you move to the city to work in the factory, right? Grandma's not around to tell you, Sonny, you need to go to church, right? You're anonymous in the big city. You can kind of go places without anybody really noticing or knowing who you are. More immoral activity, right? Drinking, prostitution, gambling, etc. Less church attendance, right? If you're in a factory, you're working 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. Are you going to spend your one day off in church? No, and people didn't. So church attendance plummeted. In Europe, it plummeted too, and it never recovered. So in Europe, they have all those beautiful cathedrals with like 6 people in them. In America, they had a great awakening, and they renewed religion. And so America is the most religious developed country in the world. It's pretty huge. 35% of Americans are just evangelicals. Just the evangelicals is 35%. In fact, right now, you can win the presidency with only the support of evangelicals. That's all you need. You don't need Catholics. You don't need atheists. You don't need anyone else. Just the evangelicals. That'll win you the presidency. That's how Trump won. I don't know how that really happened, but that's what happened. It turns out he doesn't even know what an evangelical is. So if you want to be better than Trump, listen to this definition. It just means, again, you take the Bible literally and you believe in conversion. So that literal part is important. So things like homosexuality is against Christianity because it says in the Bible, a man shall not lay with another man the way he lays with a woman. It's pretty straightforward. So the Bible is pretty explicitly anti-gay men. It says nothing about lesbians whatsoever. So, I don't know, maybe they don't take it that literally. Whoops, sorry. So this, if you think about the missionaries as immigrants, and they were. You know those people who Trump hates? Immigrants? Well, that's what the missionaries were. They're just straight up illegal immigrants. And immigrants always have what they call push factors. Things that push them out of their own country. And pull factors. Something that pulls them into the country that they move to. So in Mexico, it'd be like push factor is because of the NAFTA free trade agreement, there's no land to farm on, so you can't make a living, so you go up into America. And then the pull factor is the fact that minimum wage in America is 7 something. Minimum wage in Mexico is like 90 cents. So that's a pull factor. Okay, so in this case, the push factor is Great Awakening is saying we need to revive religion. Also, there's all these people out there who are condemned to hell simply out of ignorance, not knowing who Jesus Christ even is. If you don't know who Jesus Christ is, then how are you going to accept him as your Savior and be saved? Right? Because in this literal interpretation, it says that if you don't accept Jesus Christ, it doesn't matter why. It doesn't even matter that you don't know Jesus because you lived before Jesus lived. All those people are in hell. Plato, Socrates, Aristotle are down in hell. And we know this because Dante's Inferno, the famous book, tells depicts those philosophers in hell because they lived 300-400 years before Christ. And then there was a pull factor. There was a Hawaiian in Massachusetts and Connecticut going around telling people that they should be missionaries and come here. So the idea that, I wish the missionaries had never come, that's just very unlikely. There were a lot of compelling reasons why they came. And a third reason is simple curiosity. These are educated people. They were going to the colleges that you all will want to go to. If you want to know which ones those are, they're on a list right here. Because they're so old, they have a lot of financial aid and they will cover your full need. They're all on the East Coast, just above. And the missionaries went to a lot of the schools, like Yale, Williams College, Middlebury College in Vermont. Not Harvard, because Harvard was Unitarian, not Congregationalist. Harvard was the evil, super liberal Christians who don't take things literally. Okay. So when they first arrive, it's kind of makeshift structures. They brought a lot of cloth, cover up those naked Hawaiians. You know, the mu'u is kind of like, some people call it the sack. Just doesn't matter, fancy stitching, never mind that. Just cover up all that flesh. And one of the names you'll need to know is this one, Hiram Bingham. He was kind of the self-proclaimed leader of the first group of missionaries. Now that first group was only 2. That's why our Holy Wrap says the missionaries, though not many, had come in 1820. There wasn't many. The first group was only 2 actual missionaries, but they had their wives, they had a carpenter, and they had a doctor. The 2 missionaries were Hiram Bingham and Asa Thurston. And Hiram Bingham, when he first arrived, do you have quotable Bingham on there? Does it say the quotable Bingham? No?
Yeah.
Okay, let's see if I can get it from memory. When Bingham first arrived, the first time he actually sees Hawaiians in their own environment, he says, "The appearance of destitution, degradation, and barbarism among the chattering and almost naked savages was appalling. Can these be human beings?" Did I get it right? Word for word? All right. I have a mind like a steel trap. Unlike you guys who have a mind like a steel sieve. Yes.
Was that, what was the other guy's name?
Asa Thurston. So Asa Thurston was the grandfather of Lauren Thurston, leader of the overthrow. And he was not a missionary. Lauren Thurston was not a missionary. So that's why. Missionaries did not overthrow the kingdom. Hiram Bingham had a son named Hiram Bingham II. And he did become a missionary, but he left Hawaii and did missionary work in the South Pacific. He never was involved in the overthrow. So nobody involved in the overthrow was actually a missionary. So there was Hiram Bingham II. And then there was another son, a grandson of Hiram Bingham III. He was an archaeologist who liked to wear a hat and some cool boots like that. He was a professor of archaeology, went around having adventures. Sound familiar? Maybe a whip. Indiana Jones is based on Hiram Bingham III. Indiana Jones is Hiram Bingham III. In fact, even in the movie Indiana Jones, he says in one of the sequels, "My parents were missionaries." His parents, Hiram Bingham II is a missionary. And then there was a Hiram Bingham IV. And he has recently come to people's attention as one of the early people to shelter Jews from the Nazis in France, in occupied France. He was hiding them in the American embassy. He was a diplomat, American diplomat in France. So Hiram Bingham was a pain, but he had a really great family that came down from him. How did they view Hawaiians? Well, as you see from the quote, they saw Hawaiians as savages, but still human. That meant they had souls that needed to be saved. And if they save enough Hawaiian souls, then they themselves can be saved. Now, notice that the missionaries have to do more than the Hawaiians in order to be saved. Hawaiians just have to be good members of the church. Missionaries have to be good members of the church plus convert more members. And this idea of the white person having to do more than the native person it's called a white man's burden. You guys probably learned about that in world history, white man's burden. It's based on the idea that there was a racial hierarchy that had kind of the Western, the northern Western Europeans were at the top. Not all Europeans. At the very top was the northern and Western Europeans. So we're talking about England, France, Germany, and Scandinavian countries. That's the top, the Nordics, the Aryans. Below them were the southern and eastern Europeans, people like the Spanish and the Italians. You know, the Spanish have a siesta. They're so lazy, they take a nap at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, right? I was in Mexico, I was like going to the stores and it's 3 o'clock and I'm like, oh, everything's closed. I realized, oh, it's siesta time. But it's really hot, right? So they take a nap and then everything reopens in the evening when it cools off. So they're lazy, so they're below these industrious. Industrious, where do we hear that term?
Good and industrious.
Good industrious, right in the will, right? That's from these guys. And then as you go down, but this is still pretty high up, you have Asians. They're still relatively high up because they have cities and writing and gunpowder and ships and armies and all these things that you can't deny that this is a civilization, right? It's impossible. Yeah.
So Asians like Southeast Asians inclusive or like Chinese?
We're mostly talking Chinese. Yeah. Japan possibly, but Japan wasn't. Not much was known about Japan at this time. It's still closed. And right below the Asians are the Polynesians. Polylove, as they say now. Am I right? You guys been seeing those stickers? Polylove, established before Cook. Because whoever made the sticker doesn't know the date. Because they don't know. 1778. Cook got cooked. Not 8. And this is still pretty high. Below them are Native Americans. And the way of dealing with Native Americans was in the saying, kill the Indian, save the man. You guys heard that? Kill the Indian, save the man. What do they mean by that? Kill the culture. Make the Indian into a white person. This was used across the United States in the Indian boarding schools, right? The idea of the boarding part was take them away from the family because the family is the one that transmits the culture. If you take them away, then they kind of grow up in this context of not really knowing who they are, intermarry them with the white for a couple generations, same in Australia, and pretty soon they're not native anymore. Cut off the long hair, whiten them. Kill the Indian, save the man. Now, one of the schools that practiced that was called the Haskell Indian Institute. That's one of the most famous Indian boarding schools. And there's another school modeled on the Haskell Indian Institute that you're a little more familiar with. It's called the Kamehameha schools. So we're actually modeled on a school that was kill the Indian, save the man. And we have boarding. Coincidence? So below Native Americans, this is kind of like a solid line. These were the people capable of being saved. Under this were Africans. But that's not the bottom. The very bottom was in this fake, this is all fake, right? This is all imagined. Were Aborigines of Australia. Because they didn't even practice agriculture. So Hawaiians are not as high as Asians because they don't have cities and writing, but they have armies, they have very developed agriculture, so they're pretty civilized. Not as much as Asians, but more than like Aborigines. You know what I mean by Australian Aborigines, right? And this word here was actually the word for indigenous in Pauahi's time. That's why in the will it says, financial aid will be given to those Hawaiians of Aboriginal blood, pure or part. You guys, did we talk about this? Yeah. So Aboriginal meant indigenous, but what I'm talking about here is specifically Australian Aborigines. Maoris would be in here. Yeah. So the idea of the white man's burden is that being on top imposes a burden of lifting everybody else up to be like you. You can see how that's very ethnocentric. And yet, a lot of Hawaiians actually till today subscribe to this. Because they're like, oh yeah, we're pretty good. We're pretty close to the civilized, so-called civilized cultures. Keep in mind, when we say civilized, these are some of the cultures like Germany, Belgium, which were genocidal maniacs. The king of Belgium probably killed 30 million people, mostly in the Congo. Yeah? That's the biggest genocide of all time, much bigger than Hitler. And Hawaii had a treaty with him. Okay, so that's why you see that the missionaries have a higher standard for themselves than they do for the lower down Hawaiians, the poly-love people. Okay, a little longer. The missionaries had a mission, hence the name. So let's read through it. You guys have this, so don't freak out. Mission said, your views are not to be limited to a low or narrow scale. You are to aim at nothing short. So, think big. Aim at nothing short of covering those islands with fruitful fields and pleasant dwellings and schools and churches, of raising up the whole people to an elevated state of Christian civilization, of bringing or preparing the means of bringing thousands and millions of the present and succeeding generations to the mansions of eternal blessedness. This one I think I can do by memory also, but what do we have here? Besides, I didn't even underline churches because obviously they're going to build churches. But what else is going on here? Civilization. Specifically what? Sorry? Okay, so housing, because Hawaiians don't know how to live properly. What else? So agriculture, because Hawaiians don't know how to farm. Even though Cook said their agriculture was at the highest degree of perfection. So Cook was actually much more impressed, much more tolerant of Hawaiians than the missionaries. One more thing. Education, right? So it's much more than just religion. Okay, this is colonization or civilizing, they would say. Or colonization is this reforming people and all these different aspects of how they live, not just religion and leave everything else the same. Okay, so what did the missionaries end up affecting? Everything. The religious system, obviously, but also the social system, the economy, and the government. Okay, the religious system, obviously there's a religious void right now, so they're going to just fill it with a new god. Yeah, and if you had 40,000 gods and a new god arrives, do you think it's a difficult thing to take on this new god? No, just another god. It's just that this god says that he, and it is a he, is the only one. But they had to affect the social system, they felt, because there are certain practices that can't go on if you're going to be Christian. Like what? Incest? Related to that, kind of? Multiple spouses, right? Both. So some people say polygamy. Hawaiians are polygamous. Polygamous means a man with multiple wives. Hawaiians also had women with multiple husbands, which is called polyandry. So they're both. They wanted to affect the economy. Okay, so they would say no incest or adultery, they would call it. Okay, no incest, no adultery. We're going to watch a movie about the missionaries. It's just called Hawaii. Pretty bland title, but it's an epic film from the 60s. And in that, there's a scene where the Hiram Bingham character tries to ban adultery. And they ask him, what kind of adultery do you not like? And he goes, there is only one kind of adultery, and it is a mortal sin. And they're like, there's 23 kind of adultery that we have here. Mother sleep with son, father sleep with daughter, brother sleep with sister. They go on and on. Economy. What do they want to change? They really want Hawaiians to be what they would call gentlemen farmers. So remember, they don't like the Industrial Revolution, right? They don't want Hawaiians to be factory workers. They want them to go back to the nice, old, moral lifestyle of a farmer, a gentleman farmer, though. So work from sunrise to sunset, read the Bible at night, go to church on Sundays, market day on Saturday. That is the moral, Christian, agricultural lifestyle. That's what they want the Hawaiians to do. That's why they end up trying to introduce private land. And in the government, as far as the government, what they really need is laws to enforce these social norms and land. Because right now there's no private property. So the government they need the government to just give them land. Okay, so I think you can see that their effect on Hawaiian society is very much broader than just religion alone. Yeah? Questions, comments, speeches, random statements.
Feminist club. Making a plug. There's a feminist club. Join it. It's my club.